We are going to actually dispense with formal introductions today because they would take far too long and we want to actually have time for the substance. So you can find everybody's bios on the event webpage at cyber.pitt.edu, and you'll also find links there to the Commission's report and its subsequent work, including a new white paper released today on supply chain security. Our discussions are very much looking forward to questions from you, so please feel free to submit any questions you might have into the Q&A during the panels, and the moderators will see them and look to take as many as possible at the end. I think that takes care of our housekeeping issues, but to open the event today, we're going to be hearing from Rob Rutenbar, who is Pitt's Senior Vice Chancellor for Research. Dr. Rutenbar will be followed by Suzanne Spalding, one of the Cyberspace Solarium commissioners, for some introductory remarks. Ms. Spalding is currently at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and previously served as the Undersecretary for the NPPD at DHS, which is now known as the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So thank you both so much for joining us. Rob, let me hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Beth. Thanks very much. So I'm delighted and honored to have the opportunity to welcome everybody to this event, sponsored jointly by Pitt Cyber and CMU Scilabs. I'd like to welcome everybody from Pitt and from CMU, and especially our Cyberspace Solarium commissioners who are able to join us today. We hope you have an interesting and vigorous discussion. I've said on at least a couple of occasions that the fact that I spent 25 years on the faculty at Carnegie Mellon is probably not the only reason they hired me for this job at Pitt, but I think it was a solid bullet on my resume, and I'm just going to go with that. I was actually at Carnegie Mellon when we stood up Scilab, and I remember how exciting it was, and I remember how visionary and cool it felt, and I don't think anybody at the time appreciated how incredibly important this broad area of activity was going to be, and how wide spread the skill sets that are being researched and taught over there was going to be. And I think also in the spirit of full disclosure, if you Google Scilab and my last name, you will find papers that I did not write because my son used to work there. So I used to hear an interesting insider view of the activities over there on a fairly day-to-day basis. So this is a really nice opportunity for me to, in some sense, reconnect. Look, it is clear that we live in difficult and uncertain times, and everybody who is on at least the IT side of any large research university knows that all great schools are under constant cyber attack from cyber bad guys. Right, we're visible, we're out there. We have pretty much open websites and networks, and I think a lot of folks assume that we are less vigilant and less up to speed on protecting things. I mean, that's sort of the starting point for people in my world. How we've had to sort of approach this. But what's new is the scope and the scale of the threat to universities, to be sure, but now to core United States infrastructure, to government systems, even I would say to overall civic order. We now have sovereign actors as potential adversaries in this universe, and not just potential threats to safety and order, but also threats to our technology base. That's sort of a new one for people with my job. Worries about technology exfiltration by cyber channels is a new concern. I ended up spending a surprising amount of my time worrying about that and explaining that to my faculty and my administrative colleagues. And we now even have COVID in the mix of this conversation. Sovereign attacks on universities, on hospitals, and on research labs engaged in leading-edge COVID vaccine work. We've actually had face-to-face, or should I say mask-to-mask meetings with the FBI in Pittsburgh, entirely focused on the fact that at the University of Pittsburgh, we're one of a handful of universities with COVID viral samples working on COVID vaccines in a full-time way. The regional biocontainment facility in this end of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is in a building in the middle of the University of Pittsburgh campus. So we see these activities on a pretty much day-to-day basis. I think what's also new here is simply, as well as the size of the attack surface, is the spectrum of research necessary to try to combat these threats. I'm old enough to remember when security was a tech thing exclusively, when it was a networking thing, when maybe it was an IT thing. And today we have not only technologists, but social scientists and legal experts and policy experts heavily and essentially engaged. At Carnegie Mellon, Scilab started from engineering and computer science. At Pitt Cyber started from the law school, right? You can almost not imagine two more sort of opposite ends of the academic scholarship spectrum than that. Our first session on countering disinformation is being moderated by Michael Colaresi from the Pitt Political Science Department. And I should also note a winner of an internal proposal pitch competition for quantitative measures of disinformation, which is how I met Michael in the first place. But this panel discussion also features the participation of my longtime friend and colleague Kathleen Carley from Carnegie Mellon University. All of us got hired in the same year and met on the same couch, right, at a department head's barbecue. Kathleen started life in sociology and currently has appointments in the Carnegie Mellon School of Computer Science and the Carnegie Mellon College of Engineering and the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And I apologize, Kathleen, I'm absolutely missing a few. That is the landscape we find ourselves in, of the sort of the breadth of technologies and approaches to problems to be able to solve these things. The new reality of the cyber threat is we need all hands on deck. The status quo isn't good enough anymore. The McCain National Defense Authorization Act, which established the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, says the hope is to develop a consensus on strategic approach to defending the United States in cyberspace against cyber attacks of significant consequences. So I'm proud of the fact that both Pitt and CMU have come together to put this event together. I look forward a lot to seeing what sort of consensus might emerge from these discussions. Thank you again for being able to be here, and to all of our speakers. And with that, I'll hand things over to Suzanne.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank our sponsors as well, Pitt and CMU, for having this important conversation and for including the Cyberspace Solarium Commission members among your very distinguished group of panelists. Looking forward to the conversation this afternoon. I want to just give a little bit of context about the Solarium for the discussions that are going to take place on the next two panels. And the first question that we often get is, where does this name come from? Why are you called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission instead of just the Cyberspace Commission? And the Solarium is, most people think of a solarium as being kind of a sunroom, and in fact, that is where the name comes from. It is a particular sunroom in the White House that President Eisenhower used to use for meetings. And this is a particular reference to a meeting that he had to bring together his key national security advisors to talk about what the strategic approach to Russia should be in the months following Stalin's death. And Mike Gallagher, our co-chair, had done his thesis, if I recall correctly, on Eisenhower's Solarium and the process that was used to develop that strategy, and was a moving force behind the establishment of this commission. And of course, similarly, our tasking, as Rob said, was to develop recommendations for a strategic approach to dealing with, the challenges that we confront in cyberspace. And so that's what we did. And the report came out in March. In fact, I think it was the last big public event that I attended before we all went into lockdown and isolation. And so we are always grateful for the opportunity to be able to present it and have these conversations with folks and get some give and take, because of course a lot of the interaction that would normally have happened with groups in person hasn't happened. The approach that we took in the commission, and I should say that Mike Gallagher, Congressman, was the co-chair along with Senator Angus King. Additional members of Congress included Senator Ben Sasse and Congressman Jim Langevin. So bipartisan, bicameral representation from Congress. And then there were 6 of us from outside of government: Tom Fanning, CEO of Southern Company; Chris Inglis, former Deputy Director of NSA and Cybercom, who's here with us today; Frank Salufo, who is now down at Auburn, for a long time was at GW, and a long time expert in cybersecurity and Homeland Security, one of the founders of the Department of Homeland Security. Samantha Ravitch, former Department of Defense, now with the Fund for the Defense of Democracies, and former Congressman Pat Murphy were the non-governmental commissioners along with me. And then we had representation from the executive branch, from the key departments and agencies across the executive branch. So it was a very interesting mix, somewhat unique in that way, and remarkably bipartisan. And I think that's an important point to make. Cybersecurity has blessedly remained a largely bipartisan issue, even in Congress. And the work of this commission with its outstanding staff, led by Mark Montgomery, was entirely nonpartisan, not just bipartisan, but nonpartisan. Really, really a joy. So the strategy is one of layered defense, looking at costs, at imposing costs and increasing costs for our adversaries and reducing their benefits. So we're trying to alter, right, that cost benefit analysis. And that's what we mean when we talk about deterrence of our adversaries. It is both on that cost side and reducing the benefit side. And so we developed 6 pillars, which we break down our findings and our discussion, and about 80 plus recommendations. And the pillars range from some discussion about U.S. government organization, strengthening key aspects like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the entity that I used to lead at DHS, and the intelligence parts and the law enforcement parts and other parts that are working well. Creation of a national cybersecurity director in the White House to bring that kind of all-important coordination and cohesion that is needed because this is inevitably distributed across government. So there's a pillar on norms and international collaboration, which we think is critically important. There's a pillar on improving our cyber ecosystem, which will be the primary topic of panel 2. There's a pillar on improving resilience, which I'm going to get into in panel 1, because it's both that network systems person resilience that was mentioned, but also public resilience, for example, in the context of disinformation. A pillar on true collaboration with the private sector, and a pillar on improving the military aspects, our effectively ability to use our military authorities in this space. So that's a quick overview of the Solarium and the context in which you can think about what we're going to talk about in these next 2 panels.
All right, thank you both so much. This is the perfect framing and background about both the expansive nature of the threat and just how broad the Cyberspace Solarium Commission's remit really was. So we are going to go ahead and move to the first panel. Michael Colaresi, who is Pitt Cyber's Research and Academic Director, as well as a professor of political science, will be moderating the first panel on disinformation today. So panelists, if I can ask you to please turn on your video and audio if you're joining us for the first panel discussion. And Mike, I will hand it to you to briefly introduce folks and take it away.
Thank you so much, Beth and Rob and Suzanne's still here, yay. And welcome to everybody who's listening in to what I think will be a fantastic discussion. So we're gonna start with a discussion about countering disinformation. So let me introduce just very briefly the people we have here to talk about. I'll just be moderating. I'm Mike Colaresi. We have Kathleen Carley here, who got an introduction from Rob earlier from CMU. And we're very lucky. Thank you, Kathleen, so much for being here. Chris Inglis from the commissioner at the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, also deputy director previously at the NSA, and I believe currently distinguished visiting professor at the US Naval Academy, is here. Chris, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Laura Putnam, who's the USIS research professor of history, University of Pittsburgh, and no longer chair, I believe, of the department. Yeah. So she's really going to bring it today, right? It's like being shot out of a cannon. And Suzanne, who you met, another commissioner from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And we're very, very grateful for all of you to spend some time here talking about these crucially important issues. And I guess I wanted to start a little bit with why we need to be talking about this and why we need both the commission report, but also, thinking about the consequences of the commission's great work, specifically anchored to disinformation and what it means. So the first question I have for the panel is, what do you see as the primary threat vectors for the United States and other democracies related to digital disinformation, right? So is it the vulnerabilities that we need to worry about? Is it the new polarization that we've seen emerging, right, over decades? Is it the modes of influence instead that are new, right? So is it really that we're all using different technologies, and those technologies have specific modalities that lead, right, to a new focus on these issues and the need to consider layered defense, for example, right, in the disinformation sphere specifically? And, is it digital surveillance, advertising platforms, these sort of things? So just broadly, why should we be so worried about this? I think everyone right on this panel is worried in different ways. And it would be great to generate some discussion on that. Kathleen, would you like to start?
Sure. So in my view, there's several reasons for being worried about disinformation today. Sure, disinformation has always been with it, but today it is more global and it is capable of affecting more people in more ways. So one of the reasons to be concerned about it is because disinformation can spread globally extremely rapidly. It can also erode trust in democratic institutions and is doing so. It can also lead to, and is leading to, increasing amounts of harm. It can provoke violence, and it can also provoke individuals to actually fight against neighbors and to actually kill others simply on the basis of that disinformation at just an unprecedented scale to what we've seen before.
Great. Yeah, no, I think we definitely see a confluence in the literature across the different domains, that Rob and Suzanne were talking about at the beginning, coming to the same conclusion, right, that the scale is new and unique. Suzanne or Chris, do you want to chime in from the Commission's point of view on this? There's disinformation is talked about specifically, in particular, like malign influence campaigns in the Commission report.
So I'll take a stab at it and then let Suzanne kind of complement that, fix it. So I think there are three pieces. One, the Commission clearly determined that as we define cyber, the noun cyber, that people are an integral part of that, right? That's the whole purpose of having systems like this, to serve the interests and needs of people. But beyond serving those people, the people are a part of the system. And oftentimes when someone tries to do something illicit or inappropriate in cyberspace, they're taking advantage of the human component that might not be the strongest component. We find that people are naturally vulnerable for a lot of reasons that cyberspace can explain. It's hard to attribute actions to a particular actor in cyberspace. We live in a society which doesn't have the kind of centering or reconciling forces that it might once have had. Divisiveness is a part of our political rhetoric in ways that we might not have even expected 10, 15 years ago. And the natural divisions that create a multi-dimensional society like we have are no longer always seen as positive. That diversity isn't perhaps a strength, that sometimes divisiveness might be something that an adversary can take advantage of. Two, the means that cyberspace offers are particularly different than what you might see in a face-to-face context or a print media context. It's easier to falsify information and make it look like it's credible. It's easier to falsely attribute information. And the volume simply kind of transcends and overwhelms anything we've seen before. And humans probably aren't completely ready for that. They might be thinking that this is just a sped up or a more efficient means of reading your newspaper when it's an entirely different thing. And those then lead to the third component, which is that's not been missed by criminals or nation states who would use those to their advantage. I think when we get to the solution space, we'll then have to walk back on those three things and determine what do we do to make humans more resilient, more robust, to create critical thinking or perhaps some digital literacy. What do we do to perhaps in that means bucket to perhaps bell the cat without modulating content, which dangerously gets close to First Amendment freedoms? How do we actually make it such that you can determine that this is 5 Russians pretending to be 5,000 Americans or something else? And there need to be consequences for people who still take unfair advantage of these systems, so that we can then deter, if not properly bring consequences to bear on those people. But I think all of those add up to make this a perfect storm.
Yeah, no, I hear in your answer all of it, and you put it quite rightly. Yeah, Suzanne, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? And then we'll go to Laura.
Chris is exactly right, and you can see, of course, why it was such a delight to have this time on the commission to work with Chris. He articulates it very well. Clearly it is both, as Kathleen has said as well. Technology provides a scale and scope and intimacy of that outreach that really wasn't present in earlier days of active measures, right? When CIA wanted to be subversive in East Berlin, they started up a jazz magazine, which I just really love that, how subversive jazz is. But it was it was kind of a throw it out there, see who might pick it up, how many people might, read that. We know that technology today provides this really targeted ability to message individuals and pull them down into this vortex of social media. So I think that's a very significant difference from the past that we need to wrestle with. Technology also enables a more complex kind of disinformation that is cyber enabled, whether it's the hack and leak of emails, which the challenge of which we're getting another look at with this New York Post story today that everybody is kind of wrestling with how to handle. And I do think that story is an indication of how far we've come in thinking about this, I have to say. But that, and then the ability to use things like the potential hack into voter registration databases to cause disruption that is designed to further your information operation, right? That is your information operation, that the system is rigged, that it's all illegitimate, that that people should give up on the system, that they should not respect the outcome of the system. These are the issues that I've been looking at for the last 2.5, almost 3 years now, with respect to the justice system, because we see Russia using information operations to undermine public trust and confidence in our justice system, in our courts, and our judges. And as Kathleen noted and Chris noted, what we see with these disinformation operations is that they take advantage of weaknesses of our own making. So to your second point, right? So it is all of the above. These things get traction and they get uptake because they pick up on existing narratives. So when Russia fuels the concern that our justice system institutionalizes racism, they're not making it up. But the difference between the Russian pushing of this narrative that the system is irrevocably broken and the people who are judicial reform advocates who are marching in the streets to bring about change is that those people believe that change is possible. They may believe that it's taking way too long. They may be very frustrated at the lack of change, but ultimately their goal is to bring about change, to make the institution stronger, to make our country stronger. And the important thing to remember, certainly with respect to Russia's information operations and frankly, any of our adversary nations, that's not their goal. Their goal is not to make us stronger.
Yeah, no, I think those are all great points, and connect together the idea that it's just so hard to identify sort of authentic, right, communication and intentions, in this atmosphere, and I'm sure we'll get back to that too. Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I think these are crucial points that have been raised already, and all of them point to the need to think in terms of systems rather than to think of information and disinformation in an atomized way. And that's one of the reasons that, although I understand why the analogy of digital literacy is sort of attractive, I actually think it's pretty deceptive, because literacy makes us think of a sort of atomized or a cognitive issue. So it's about learning to read something and learning to separate truth from falsehood. It's an atomized image, right? If I'm literate, if I as an individual know how to decode a message in writing on a page in front of me. But of course, all of the examples that my fellow panelists are giving are about the way that systems interrelate and even what information is arriving before me is changing the context in which I'm reading that is changing, who I'm trusting and who I'm not trusting as I try to make sense and evaluate the signals that I'm getting from the world, that's being changed as well. And so rather than thinking, so I think that all of that calls for a sort of ecosystem analogy or an infrastructure analogy rather than a literacy analogy. Because an ecosystem can be healthy, when certain things are taken away, for instance, mediating institutions and face-to-face ties decay, then that leaves space within the ecosystem for new kinds of growth and new kinds of expansion. Sort of there's oxygen for new things to take up. And I'll note also that part of, I think, what our research, which is sort of focused on finding disinformation in the wild, so doing empirical research on patterns of political perception and participation, and noticing where disinformation comes into people's lives and how people wrestle with it. One thing that becomes really clear is that it's not just so that the increased vulnerability that's come with recent technological change over the last 5 to 10 years. One piece of it is about disintermediation, right? This is something that people often talk about in information space, the ways that digital search and web-based access to information has sort of disrupted traditional gatekeepers, right? So that I can reach out and I type into a search box and I find myself, falling down a YouTube rabbit hole and pursuing conspiracy theories. So part of that's about traditional gatekeepers, falling away. But it's also actually, I think, so one thing that people have been thinking about in this realm is thinking about disintermediation and how that changes information seeking and the ways that people make sense of information. I think we also need to be thinking about how the shifted technological landscape has made re-intermediation cheaper and more beneficial for bad actors. So it's not just about the disintermediation, but it's about how it's become cheap and advantageous to actively shift people away from what had been trusted interlocutors, what had been trusted institutions, and sort of stand up new alternatives that intermediate as people receive information, but do so in ways that can be easily manipulated and can be very valuable for bad actors in ways that have been really, we're seeing particularly with the coronavirus pandemic, just how impactful that can be for public knowledge of sort of basic facts and public health and so on. So these are really critical. I think these are the critical issues for us to look at.
Thanks. So I want to point out, like, one of the things working across domains and working with people in health, right, and in politics, and on different issues, is that you see very similar structure, right, that everyone's talking about, although often it's sort of separated in, what we think about as a specific case, right? So people really worried about, are people going to take the vaccines? Like, when we have it, like, even if the technical problem is solved and there's enough glass vials, right? Like, will the human element be there? Are really thinking about a lot of the same problems that we think about with, like, political problems and political knowledge diffusing on those things. And so the systems perspective, right, is both incredibly important, but doesn't really point to, well, how do you make it resilient, right? And Laura, your point is, it's not just that the gatekeepers are gone and we have to put them back, right? Is that there's new gatekeepers and there's fake gatekeepers, and it's easier to sort of recreate the world that people see that is incredibly challenging. And so I think all of that's a great point. Does anyone want to follow up before I move into another sort of related question?
As Chris, I just want to double down on Laura's point. I think that's a particularly good point, which is that what we're really talking about is a system, and therefore our response needs to be a systemized or an institutionalized response. Think of how the adversaries in this space, whoever they might be, think of going after it. They think naturally of it as a system, and they naturally collaborate with one another, at least implicitly, in terms of finding in a Darwinian context the weaknesses in that system. And if we offer up point defenses or single-threaded defenses, we will naturally fail.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And Laura, I love the analogy, the question, should we analogize, for example, to something more like infrastructure? So of course, that's a big part of what I have spent my career looking at, critical infrastructure protection. And for those who are, who are used to sort of traditional ways of thinking about risk management, which is really what we're talking about here. Almost everything we deal with, it comes back to risk management. You think about that classic formula of threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences, and assessing those to prioritize what you worry about most, right? And most of the time it's going to be about consequences. What is going to have the greatest impact? And it is the same in the disinformation context, right? So COVID rises to a very high level of concern because of the potential impact of that disinformation. Election disinformation because of the potential impact. But you look at all three. What are the threats? Who wants to exploit that? And then what are our vulnerabilities to it? And then by breaking it down, when you go then to mitigate, to manage that risk, you're much more mindful that you have to do so looking at how do I mitigate the threat? How do I reduce our vulnerability to that threat? And then how do we reduce the impact of that threat? And that's kind of how the Solarium Commission went about thinking about the whole cyberspace challenge was along very similar lines. And if you look at the pillars, they kind of line up that way. And I think in cyberspace traditionally, and I think somewhat in misinformation, disinformation as well, we neglect consequence. We don't spend enough time thinking about how we reduce the impact. And that's where this notion of public resilience, my push right now for looking at civic education as a national security imperative, to build public resilience against the content of the messaging. So they don't have to look necessarily to tell, is this true or false, or be an expert in that. They don't necessarily have to know, is this coming from Russia or is it a domestic voice? We reduce one of the vulnerabilities, which is our openness to these narratives and to believing that the system is rigged, and the growing mistrust in our institutions, by teaching people what those institutions are about, what are the mechanisms of accountability, and how can an individual be empowered to be a more effective agent of change. And I think if we can convince individuals and empower them sincerely to be more effective at holding institutions accountable and bringing about change, they will be less susceptible to these influences that reduce public trust in the institutions. And over the long term, that's a way of reducing the consequences in a risk management sense.
Great. Building up on that, Kathleen, I wanted to bring you in here on, so we have a threat. It's complicated, right? There's a lot of facets of this that make it, very difficult and potentially, uniquely difficult for democracies to deal with, right? Given democracies flow information, right? We are a system of information. That's what elections are and other things. It's crucially important. So I'm wondering if you can't, or if we can think about ways of hope. Like, are there local islands, right, of resilience to this? Are there communities? Are there examples? Be they technologies, social systems, stories that each of you have run into and thought about that give you hope that we can confront what I think is a significant challenge to both conceptualization, right, and articulation of goals and progress moving forward. So at the macro level, right, there's been a lot of energy building social resilience, sometimes other democracies. So Estonia and Finland, right? So we're not the only country in the world, right, dealing with dis and misinformation around elections and at other times. So what can we learn from these other contexts, right? There are specific communities, right, that are suffering from particular types of disinformation. And so, Kathleen, I'd like to go to you first on this, but to everybody, like, where's the hope, right? Where are the beacons or the dots that we can connect, right, to move this forward?
So partly we know what's resilient by looking at what has failed and why they have failed to be resilient. So where we see resilient communities, in general, they're ones where you have a higher informed, more highly educated, more broadly read set of individuals, but who also have a set of others around them, whether they're news bots or other people who they actually really know, and they know the source. Where we see things not being resilient are and part of the reason all this is true is because when you have an influence campaign in social media, and this makes it very different than what we see in cybersecurity and what we see in many other domains, is that campaign is not just about spreading disinformation. It's not just about the narrative, but it's also about changing, literally changing who is talking to who are the important opinion leaders, and what groups exist. So we actually see in social media, the adversaries actually going in and creating groups, bridging groups together, and then priming them so that they become more attuned to each other and to disinformation. And then they are, once they're primed, if they want them to behave offline in the real world in some particular way, they will then send them very emotionally charged messaging. So groups that are more resilient to this are the ones that, again, that are more informed, that are connected by real individuals, that aren't likely to just join whatever fad group of the day appears, and that are willing to take a break from things when it gets emotionally charged and to kind of step back. In contrast, the groups that are very at risk are those that already feel like they are always being attacked. So African Americans feel like they're always being attacked. They are marker targeted. What do? They take their voices out of the conversation. That does not help them be resilient. And moreover, it gives more play then to attack other groups. Okay, so not taking your voice out is another thing that makes groups resilient. The other thing is, like I said, having a community. In the Ukraine and in Estonia, we see these groups of people who don't even know each other, who, Russia goes in and they embed people in there to start introducing them to each other. And then once they form a group out, then they start talking to them about, how to get in various corrupt practices or where to go fight, like in the Euromaidan revolution and so on. And they build the group. So you can build in a lack of resilience. And to counter it is a much more dispersed thing. It is not just about building institutions and teaching people about, trusted sources.
No, I think the asymmetry of this is really, really important. How hard it is to educate people and build resilience, to identify these kinds of strategies is way harder than implementing them right online, given the sort of ICT we live in today. It's a great point. Laura, I wanted to go to you next on this.
Sure. Yeah, I think these are crucial points that have been raised, especially, Kathleen is really pointing to the relational nature of this, that that their interpersonal relationships are really crucial to building in resilience. And I think that's ultimately the reason that there's, if you say, where's the hope? The hope is that the things that we should be doing as a society, if we have a somewhat bigger picture, longer time frame vision of what threats are, and we think in terms of infrastructure, strengthening infrastructure, reducing vulnerability, actually, there aren't trade-offs. They're positive circles. They're virtuous circles. So the same things that we would want to be doing in order to make society more resilient, which is about increasing trust by offering new opportunities for more interpersonal relationships to be created, that's all good. It's not so whereas if we think in a sort of more atomized way, like, should I block this one piece of information? There are First Amendment trade-offs and so on. If we think like, should we be doing a better job of funding community colleges to bring to network outward into their communities and network laterally with larger academic institutions, so that people who are in community colleges are serving as a conduit for trust between their home community and larger research institutions? Like, the answer is yes, and that's all. It's like good. It's not a good bad. There's not a trade-off there. Those are things that are actually going to have lots of positive externalities, and there's every reason for us to be investing in them. Sort of similarly, the other things that would be beneficial for the ecosystem within which currently disinformation thrives is creating better knowledge of and understanding of, for instance, the functioning of the press, not just in the abstract in terms of civic education, but concretely giving, for instance, high school students a chance to establish relationships with local newspapers, with reporters. Those are the kind of things that would be both good for civic education, good for building the kinds of relationships that are going to enable people to function in a healthier way for themselves, not just facing a single piece of information, but in their relationships more broadly. And again, all of those are win-wins. So that's the hope, I think.
Chris, go ahead. You had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, so I'd like to paraphrase and perhaps build from an article that many of you may be familiar with by Reed Standish a few years ago, where he asked the question, wasn't a rhetorical question, why are the Finns, the nation of Finland, not worried about the Russians careening into their election the way we are? And the short answer, as you indicated, wasn't that the Russians weren't trying. He offered three, perhaps kind of combining interleaved strategies. The first was that the Finns were not standing still waiting to be picked apart. They actually kind of went to some time and effort, not simply within their government, but between the government and the private sector, to have a very strong belief system about the power of their democracy and a forward momentum about what things they were committed to. And I think in the spirit that nature abhors a vacuum, the lesson for us is that if you are internally naturally divided, if you don't believe in anything in particular, if you haven't taken the time to tell your own story first, you offer the opportunities for others to enter in and tell that story for you, or to knock you off an otherwise weak forward trail. Second, kind of Reed, he indicated that the Finns have a very good school system from kindergarten up that raises critical thinkers, not people who simply memorize and parrot back, but actually possessed of broad sources of information, take advantage of that and try to determine not simply what they believe, but why they believe it, and naturally kind of apply the triangulation that I think is useful in this. And third, he offered that the people in Finland have a wide set of experiences with the Russians, such that they can recognize what that looks like as it careens across their virtual field. And I kind of go back to what Laura had indicated, which is that digital literacy is not in and of itself the answer here, but broad experience in what it means to live in the digital kind of environment, that ecosystem, will equip our children and our adults with perhaps a better opportunity to understand what's being done to them and why. To all of those three, I would add a fourth, which might seem trivial at first, but disconnected populations that simply aren't available to a miscreant in this space, they're also kind of somewhat resilient and robust. And while that's perhaps a ludicrous example, I think that technology can help people by belling the cat, by perhaps putting some greater attribution and a sense of provenance on the sources of information, allow people to naturally isolate themselves, to say, I think I will willingly accept information from this source because I know something about the provenance or the proof of where this is coming from, or to naturally isolate themselves from some sources because, again, they have a better attribution in a space that's not been well known for having strong attribution.
And I guess I would add two quick points to that list. The fifth or sixth, where were we? Fifth, I think, would be that the countries where we've seen some success in this, the messaging starts at the very top. And the countries where we've seen some backsliding on this, so there are countries in Eastern and Central Europe that were off to a good start on coming up with effective ways to counter Russian disinformation. But when their democracy as a whole started backsliding, and they did not, those entities or efforts within the country no longer had the support and clear messaging from their leaders, those efforts began to founder. And so without getting, I know we want to probably, keep partisan politics out of this. I don't actually think it's partisan, but I think it is important to emphasize how incredibly difficult this is if you don't have clear messages coming from your top leadership on these points. So I think that's really important. And then I just wanted to very quickly pick up on Laura's win-win and her reference to local news. And of course, then that leads to supporting stronger local news organizations and helping to lift them up as another really important win-win here, because they are the most trusted source of news for Americans, by and large, according to the polls and surveys, and they are suffering.
I think that's actually, so that's a really good example, right? Where we can get a foothold of where there are these trusted news sources. There's a number of different things to build on. And I think I really do urge people to read at least the executive summary, right, of the Solarium report. So a lot of the concepts of cybersecurity generally absolutely apply to mis and disinformation. And it's a fantastic resource, for everyone. And but we also see those footholds. So I want to be positive. I want to be optimistic, right? But those footholds people know about them, right? In the system, when there are adversaries out there, they see where the potential footholds of resilience are, and they chip away at them, right? So we have the recent news stories of the aping of local news sources because they are trusted, and that trust can then be abused, right? And that gets, so, every point of resilience, right, can also potentially, if you don't see it first and act on it quickly, right, can be used as a point of vulnerability, for this. And that kind of leads to, unless anyone wants to jump in on this point, I wanted to move towards more specific points, in particular, get back to our discussion about digital literacy. But before I do that, all right. So one of the key recommendations that we've already talked about quite a bit, but I want to put in context of a few other of the recommendations, and I'll just read a little bit here. The US government should promote digital literacy, civics education, and public awareness to build societal resilience to foreign, malign, cyber-enabled information operations. I think one thing we're bringing, people with expertise in government and these reports, right, and universities that are delivering education, and we have connections with high schools and other places. How do we do it? Right? Like the next thing I want to talk about is we have these footholds where education and letting people know both what's out there and how to be critical thinkers, right, is a crucial piece of the next step of building resilience. And I wonder if people have advice for everyone here, because in some sense, like, we are the message, like, we need to deliver this in curriculum, in connections. And so what's the role of universities in building this resilience? And in particular, right, how can expertise in humanities and social sciences, right, fuse with engineering and other, points of foci, right, with technical understandings, information, computer science, and engineering? Do we need new disciplines to do this? Like, do we really need more coherent? Are institutes enough in centers, right? So I sort of leave the floor open, but what I want to sort of charge you with is, help us do this. What is your advice, right, for the next year, 5 years, 10 years? What do we do to deliver on this promise and build this resilience? And so Suzanne, why don't we start with you on this?
Well, I was really hoping to hear from the panelists who are involved in academia first on this. I guess my little piece of this, again, that I would make a push for, is that even at that college and university level and community college level that Laura talked about, not assuming that students arrive with a solid grounding in civic education. Because we have, the surveys and the statistics show we have really dropped the ball on civic education in this country, and there's a growing consensus around this in Congress and push for greater emphasis on civic education. But I think that is really an important part of it. So again, this notion that we're not just to focus on the mechanisms of disinformation. In the way that Laura talked about needing to think about this more broadly. I think giving people that, reminder of what our shared values are and our shared beliefs. When we talk about what other countries do well, they have an advantage in being small and more homogeneous, but they do really emphasize shared beliefs. I believe our diversity is a strength. I do believe that Russia is trying to practice jujitsu. They think they're going to be able to use our strengths against us and maybe get us to give up on some of our strengths like free speech. And I think we have to fight that with everything we've got. And we've got to fight it on our grounds. We've got to fight it with our strengths, not be convinced that our strengths are actually weaknesses. They can present vulnerabilities, but we need to think about why they are a source of strength and how do we use that strength to counter this adversary activity.
Thanks. So Laura or Kathleen, do you want to give the university answers?
Sure. So I can. From my perspective, we absolutely need a new discipline. And in fact, when this was brought up at a for the first time ever, they did what was called a decadal survey of the social sciences at the National Science Foundation for the intelligence community. And they actually recognized a new scientific discipline is emerging in this area called social cybersecurity. And it's very important to recognize that this is a computational social science. It is not owned by computer science, nor is it owned exclusively by the social science, but it needs new transdisciplinary theories and methods. And there are several reasons for that. One is because left to their own devices, for example, machine learning, computer science, often looks at these problems and does them in the virtual lab, like with just your computer and the data set that was created 6 months ago. But this is an area where things are moving so fast that none of that stuff is applicable by the time it gets operationalized. From the social science side, people often tend to think of this from a decision theory perspective or a belief in psychology and think it's all just, how we make people think, without recognizing that this is also about what's called social cognition. That is, if I can get you to think that everybody knows out there that something is true, you will think it because you want to be part of the social and part of that everybody. So you need to bring in the anthropology and so on. So I definitely think we need a whole new discipline. And I think the tenets of this discipline are not just at the college level. Right now, they're kind of at the PhD level. They need to be pushed down to the undergraduate level and into the high schools. The other thing I would say is I want to pick up on something that was raised earlier about education being important. And I would say that that's absolutely true. And at the grade school level, one thing to really focus on is spelling. Why? Because at least for the next few years, you can tell what are the disinformation sites. You can tell what are the pink slime newspapers. You can tell what the fake news are sites because they have spelling errors all through them, right? And so they will spell the name of a normal newspaper, but with the wrong letters, for just one letter off. Another thing it's very important is to teach people how easy they can be deceived. Because most people think, I recognize fake news all the time. I recognize disinformation all the time, and it won't happen to me. But they usually only recognize it if they see it in the opposing party or the opposing group's disinformation, not on their own view of the world kind of side. And people don't realize, they also don't know how to tell when they're being micro-targeted. Those are things you could easily bring down into junior highs and into high school to help people understand, this is a form of cyberbullying. Here's how to see it. And finally, I want to mention that with respect to critical thinking, we're all talking about, we should teach critical thinking. We should teach digital literacy. But the problem isn't teaching it. It's that what people really think is true in those areas is not necessarily true anymore, given the way the technologies work. You can't just go to 3 sources anymore and then say, all 3 sources agree, so therefore it must be true. That's not true because they're owned by the same conglomerate. So we need to rethink what we mean by critical thinking. And then we need to think of ways of doing it at scale that will transfer across all the different platforms.
Great. Thank you. Chris, I think I saw you jump in a couple times. And then
yes, I was just going to offer perhaps an illustrative example of what Kathleen was talking about. At the U.S. Naval Academy, we have a cyber operations major. Unfortunately, by most people, that's assumed to be cyber operations. It's not at all that. It's actually preparing our students who are going to one day lead the Navy or the Marine Corps to succeed in whatever their operations might be in a world dependent upon cyber. And so the major itself is actually not inside the computer science or technology department. It's actually a meld of 3 things. We teach them enough about technology to understand how it works, what the dependencies might be. We then teach them mandatory courses in human factors to understand the human component of that. Much of the discussion here today would be very familiar to those students. And then we teach them the law, the ethics, such that they understand what an American or a liberal democracy's approach to this must be. The defense of the other kind of great goods in our society, like the liberal privileges that are defined in our Constitution. The Naval Academy has a strategy that essentially is described as the all many few. I've just described what a relative few study. They major in cyber, but for many, whether they're studying law or political science or other disciplines, they need to know more about cyber than they might otherwise based upon an historical review of what material is brought to bear. And then everyone at the Naval Academy has to take 2 courses in cyber, cut out much the same way that I described the major field of study. such that they understand something about cyber that will inform their activities as an individual or as the leader or as a responsible person for operations in a world that we believe this moment forward are always going to be dependent upon that digital infrastructure.
Thank you. Great. Laura.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of what comes through in all of these answers is that a sort of naive model which says we just need to teach people to recognize disinformation, that's just a non-starter at this point. I think we need to just recognize that it's time to step away from that as the goal, try to stop perfecting that. If we recognize that the disinformation distrust cycle is systemic and changes systems, then it becomes clear why just telling people to distrust more within it is not, without making other shifts, is not helpful. And we see this in our, empirical observations when we see within, for instance, Facebook groups, false information being shared. It's often the people who are sharing that information themselves are fully immersed in the language of fact checking, of fake news. Those terms have become terms that you throw around as weapons to deflect actually accurate information and to deflect what would be otherwise appropriately authoritative sources of information. So again, the question is thinking in terms of the relational aspects of human systems. And so asking oneself, and understanding that trust is not simply trust has cognitive components, but it's not simply a cognitive thing and it's not simply an itemized thing. Thinking relationally and thinking, who needs to learn, who needs to be given the opportunity to get to know and trust who, so that it's not just about a lesson. And that's not, it's not instantly scalable. So that may not seem as, sort of as easy of a solution, but an easy solution that doesn't solve, of course, isn't easy either. So, and again, I take us back to the point that there are win-wins here, because things like adding in certain kinds of, building relationships for education about the press, about public health, about how academic knowledge is produced, and doing so in a way that weaves people who might be in communities that feel themselves to be marginalized in cities, in rural areas and more, into networks of trust, given the opportunity to actually build relationships and build trust with people who they might not otherwise have a chance to meet and build trust with, builds an enormous resilience. That's not a one-off, that's a lifetime game changer. So I think it's at that scale that we need to be thinking.
That makes sense. That actually brings up an interesting example. We're going to switch to Q&A from audience here, very, very quickly. But, one of the interesting things about education in universities and high schools that I think sort of harmonizes with a lot of what's being said is, universities are also places where people make social connections. And one of the things we've seen over the last 20, 30 years is this sorting, right, that's happening where like people are finding like people. And what we find in some of our work is that diversity can be weaponized, and it becomes a vulnerability when it's disconnected diversity, right? When you don't have the connections between the unique insights that are offered by different experiences and communities around the world. But if you bring those together, right, if there's enough shared values, communication, and infrastructure, and one thing universities can do is by offering new disciplines that bring people together with different strengths, but show them how to share those strengths together. And that's geographic, right? So across, campuses and across different interests. I think it's a real growth area that I think builds on some of these points that each of you have talked about. I think we're right. Anyone else have final questions or want to final points on the delivery of these things? And we'll go to questions if there are any. There's no audience Q&A yet, so I have more. So so I have one I wanted to make sure we talked about. So I've written on legislative oversight, and so I was super excited in the report, right, to see in particular a call for a select permanent committee studying these technical issues and building up resilience in this area. But I also think it's kind of an example of why I worry about whether we're up to this challenge in the changing sort of ICT environment in that we're in. And these changes, meeting these requirements, building the bridges and relationships, right? Doing the training, changing how we deliver critical thinking, like Kathleen is talking about, it requires political and social will, right? And capital. It takes social learning, right? And it takes capital to deliver, both on the part of the public, right, and leaders. But disinformation absolutely hacks away at that. One of the most depressing things we find in these simulation models of disinformation is that there's kind of an event horizon where if you let disinformation fester to a certain point, you can't bring people back to agree on institutions, right, to fix the problem, right? Things just get broken. Now, that's a simulation, that's not the real world. But I'm interested in how do we do this? Right now, this is kind of across levels, right? For the public and leadership, if it helps, one specific case is how do we build the specific will, right, to increase legislative oversight in, right, cybersecurity, right, that the commission calls for, right? What are the steps to do this? But I'm open to other suggestions too. I don't think we're past the event horizon of distrust yet, but maybe we can see it. And so I would love your thoughts on that issue. And this is open to anybody to chime in on.
I'll just begin by offering a view from the Solarium Commission. So that particular recommendation about trying to come up with a single, or at least a single lens through which legislation, hearings, government action from the legislative branch should be considered was a part of a broader set of recommendations that were trying to make government coherent, joined up, a viable partner to the private sector, believing that the government had a role to play, not alone, but in collaboration with the private sector. What we heard time and again was the government itself is not joined up. The government is incoherent, not simply inefficient, which I think was the intention of the framers of the Constitution, to make it inefficient, but it's incoherent, right? And so that panel, the Select Committee on Cyber, which would not replace all the others, but would create coherence out of all the others, we believed was essential. And interestingly, it was perhaps that torch was led, that parade was led by the members themselves who, from the legislative branch, brought their experience to the table and said, without that, the government's going to have at least an opportunity cost in being joined up in terms of the legislative voice.
Makes sense. I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Yep, thank you. I will be candid enough to admit that I was late in coming to any kind of enthusiasm for this recommendation. Just to be candid, I ultimately was persuaded that it was something we did in fact need to recommend. And I'll give you a little bit of why I was reluctant and why I ultimately came around. I spent a number of years on the Hill in two different capacities, on personal staff and on the Senate Intel Committee, and third time on the House Intel Committee staff. And in my time at DHS, in the years, certainly since the early to mid 90s, starting to look at critical infrastructure and risk management, et cetera, and cyber, one of my passions is as helping people understand the ways in which cyber cannot just be pulled out and put in a stovepipe, that it is part and parcel of, for example, the critical infrastructure mission. You have to look at it holistically. You have to look at it across physical and cyber, and the danger. And so I've always been opposed to a Department of Cybersecurity, for example. So, and I fought to keep cybersecurity, the CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, focused on the full range of threats and hazards to critical infrastructure. So that was my reluctance. I was nervous about pulling this out and putting it in a stovepipe. I was also worried that even if Congress went along with it, they would create a committee that then had no power and was given no jurisdiction and really couldn't do anything. So those are the risks. And I think they need to be kept in mind. If and as you set this up, you've got to figure out how to mitigate those risks, because they are very real risks. On the other hand, I also believe very firmly that for the same kinds of reasons, cyber needs to be distributed across lots of different entities in the federal government, state and local government, private sector, academia, lots of important players. And so this, and And so again, this is the need for a national cybersecurity director in the White House and the need for a place in Congress, whereas Michael, as you said, where competence can be built over time. It's like the intelligence committees, right? Intelligence is a very complex and difficult area, not the least of which is because it's shrouded in too much secrecy. But members need some time to develop that expertise and focus. And so I think the same is true with respect to cyber. And as Chris says, we need a place where the threads in the various committees, which have to stay there, sadly, because that's the way we're going to address this from a risk management perspective, nevertheless come together in a strategic approach. So standing up this national cybersecurity director, should that go forward, will require the same sorts of risk mitigation against how it could go wrong, right? Standing up this committee the same way.
That makes perfect sense. So I'm being told we're kind of out of time. So Laura or Kathleen, if you have quick things to add, feel free. But I think there's literally, they're going to yank me like to the side here. Beth is merciless.
I just have a very quick thing to say, because of all the work that we have done with NATO, is that this is not a unique challenge to the U.S. It's a global problem, and that we need to think about doing these policy changes, not just within country, but at a global level as well. That's all.
I just want to thank everyone so much for listening, and for our panelists. This was fantastic, and I'm just really glad to have been a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you guys so much.
Thank you,
This was a fantastic discussion. Luckily, we still get to hang on to Chris for another minute or two for the next panel too. So we're going to shift gears a bit, but I imagine we're going to hear a lot of the same themes about resilience going forward. So we're going to talk about the cybersecurity ecosystem now. Our moderator for this discussion is Bill Wilson, who is the acting director of CERT at the Software Engineering Institute at CMU. So panelists, for the second panel, if we can ask you to please go ahead and turn on your audio and video. And Bill, all yours.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. First, I'll start by thanking our first panel. Thanks to Michael, Laura, Kathleen, Suzanne, and Chris. I take away two lessons from the first panel, and that is I think they've left us some threads and toeholds for this group to pull on as we move into the second topic of improving the cybersecurity ecosystem. The second thing I learned is that I think we, and likely the participants, could easily use 2 or 3 times the amount of time that we have this afternoon. So over the next 40 to 45 minutes, we'll try to structure the conversation, hearing mainly from our 4 panelists. Chris will provide some continuity, again, the view of the commissioner, but also from the first panel. We're joined by another commissioner, Frank Salufo, who was introduced previously by Suzanne, Lori Craner, the director of CMU Scilab, and Martin Weiss from Pitt School of Computing Information, round out our crew today. I'd like to take a cue from Michael and start where he started panel 1, which was, kind of in or navigating from the why, and would like to give each of the panelists an opportunity to speak to what they view as the critical issues, risks, or concerns with our current ecosystem. The Solarium report remarkably starts with a warning from tomorrow. It's an opportunity for our panelists to perhaps give a little flavor of a warning from today. And so just with the anchor that the report defines our cyber ecosystem as the people, processes, data, and technology that constitute and depend on cyberspace. If I could, I'll start with Frank with a view from the Commission in terms of his view of the drivers and concerns with our ecosystem.
Sure. Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you to Carnegie Mellon and Pittsburgh for the opportunity to join you today. I'll try to be brief. Anyone who knows me can tell that is not my strong suit, since I've never had an unspoken thought, but I'll just try to pick up on a couple of quick themes. I mean, firstly, the premise, I think we have to go into this recognizing that our ability to network has far outpaced our ability to protect networks. I mean, that is the bottom line here. The initiative remains with the attacker. First mover initiative is a significant set of issues. And we at the Commission recognize we need to recalibrate our approach, and that's not to erode our ability to project some of our capabilities, but the blue sides of the issues, the ability to defend networks was principal in terms of how we go forward. And we sought different ways to try to flip that equation. So I think the topic of this particular panel in terms of reshaping the ecosystem, and it's not to get academic, but it really does need to be seen in the totality and in the broader context of the other 5 pillars, since this is simply one of those. So at the end of the day, our report, I think section by section can stand pretty strong, but it's really in the integration of all the various pieces that I think you see one section enabling another. Bottom line is we saw within this particular panel of reshaping the ecosystem, we saw 5 primary objectives or drivers or enablers that we needed to achieve. The first one is obviously building more secure technology. And I'm really excited to hear what Lori has to say. I'm a big proponent of some of the thinking you're doing right now we called for a national labeling and certification sort of process for technologies, and I think Carnegie Mellon's doing some really innovative work in that space. So I applaud that. The second is inducing changes in behavior, and this again on the blue side of the sets of issues. So these are practices, processes. At the end of the day, technology changes, human nature remains consistent. How do we induce changes to be able to ensure that all boats rise on a whole host of these issues? And the bottom line is there's a lot of blocking and tackling here that still needs to occur that isn't. So we recognize the need to move in that direction. The third objective is sort of leveraging large scale ICT enablers. So at the end of the day, even in the sector that's probably most secure, take financial services, the big 6 banks and what they're able to do, both in terms of resources, capabilities, compared to small and regional banks is night and day. So the big banks are spending hundreds of millions of dollars each year to defend their systems. Obviously, that can't necessarily be scaled. So how do you find those aggregated points to be able to scale impact? And some of this could be when you're looking at the cloud, how do you provide mass solutions where some of the users themselves may not have the resources to be able to get things done. The fourth was a topic that I am most passionate about: supply chain, supply chain, supply chain, supply chain. The reality is we don't have visibility within our supply chains right now from a hardware, firmware, software perspective. So I think this is a key set of issues. I might note that we just released this morning, an appendix on supply chain security. Happy to get into that in greater depth and hope we can discuss that, because to me, that's the biggest set of issues right now that we need to get our arms around. And then the fifth and final point that we touched on was the harmonization of the current patchwork of norms, laws, and governance structures. So that it's not that there's not a lot of good work there. It's harnessing that, integrating that, prioritizing it, and ultimately translating the nouns into the verbs and doing it. So at the end of the day, those were sort of those 5 drivers that we were looking at to be able to get to a place of where we want to end up. So like I said, I've never had an unspoken thought, but I'll stop there.
No, I appreciate it. In some cases, it seems like we're both operating from the same set of notes, Frank, so that's great. My goal is to get the 5 of us into hopefully some aspect of each of those 5 the strategic objectives of Pillar 4. And before we jump into that first one, and when we go there, I will let Lori lead, but I figured I would give Martin an opportunity to just get back to the why, maybe share some of his risks or concerns with the current cyber ecosystem.
Martin, thank you. Thank you very much. So, I was reflecting on this panel, reflecting on the report. I just kind of reread it again, just over the weekend, just to make sure my fresh on it. And I guess walking away with it, I kind of think that we're still in the really early innings of this whole cyber experience as human beings. I mean, we're, and so some of, again, if we think about what we see today, that was really specifically what your question was about. We see a lot of adapting to what this new circumstance is. How do we deal with it? How do we cope with it? And it's not without rough patches. I mean, our government our government isn't known for efficiency. I mean, that's by design, I think, and so it's not surprising to me that we don't have everything in place and everything organized. I think going forward, we're going to continue to see faster innovation on the part of attackers, and we are going to be able to respond. So our response has to be more systemic rather than incident oriented. I guess, again, unlike Frank, I tend to be more on the brief side, so I'm going to stop it here.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I'm anxious actually to get into the strategic objectives. I have to admit, I'm a proponent of the Commission's work as well as the report format itself. For all participants, just a little more background. Yes, this pillar on the ecosystem is broken into 5 strategic objectives. It then is broken further down into 7 key recommendations, each with a set of enabling recommendations. And then one of the things that I appreciate the most is where appropriate, right, accompanying legislative proposals have been added. So all throughout from start to finish is very actionable document. So speaking of action, I'll start with that first recommendation. As you said, Frank, incentivizing greater security in the markets for technology. You wanted to hear about some of Lori's work. I'll let her start and speak to her thoughts on how we can best incentivize and support product manufacturers and solution providers, and some thoughts on what they should be doing.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I agree that incentives are a big concern, and it's difficult sometimes to figure out the right approach to incentivizing companies. I think, we tend to try to have somewhat of a hands-off, government not stepping in too much approach, but then often we're left with not enough incentives for the companies to act. So the work that we've been doing at CMU that Frank mentioned was to develop an IoT security and privacy label. And the idea here is, so we observed that, increasingly there's information in the press about IoT devices and their security and privacy problems. And if you as a consumer, read about this, and then you go to Home Depot or Best Buy or Amazon to go and buy your IoT light switch or doorbell or whatever, and you want one that doesn't have the security and privacy problems, there's really no way for you to get information about which devices have problems and which ones have extra security features. And so we came up with the idea of something like a nutrition label that would provide consumers with the security and privacy information. And we did some testing with consumers. Consumers loved the idea. And then when we asked them, well, what do you want to see on the label? Basically what they said was, well, we don't know what we don't know. So we want experts to tell us what we need to know. So then we went and interviewed about 24 experts and asked them, well, what should consumers know? And experts gave us 47 different pieces of information that they wanted on the label, which is clearly too many for an easy to digest consumer label. So we did some work on prioritizing them, came up with a much shorter list that we view as the primary layer of the label that could actually go on the packaging or the first thing that you would see online. And then you can click through to get all the gory details that the experts would want to see as well. We've done some consumer testing with that, and it seems to be pretty good. So we have on our website, iotsecurityprivacy.org, you can see a mock-up of the label and the complete specification, and even a tool you can use if you want to try generating some labels. So at this point, we've also written a number of papers, which are on the website as well. At this point, we have kind of a pretty good proposal for a label design, and we'd really like to see companies actually try it out, either for real or even just pilot testing it, going through the steps of how would we generate this label for our products. And then this is where we're stopped. We as academics have done the research, but we haven't yet found industry partners who want to push forward with actually trying this.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. I'd like to pull Chris into the conversation. Any thoughts you'd like to share on incentives, in particular, if there are any recent or current initiatives that you feel have demonstrated success or show us the way forward?
Yeah, so I'd make 2 points. One, back to your first question, which I think informs the second. Which is, I think from the Commission's perspective, what we found is across all the elements of a cyber ecosystem, the thing that was perhaps most wanting wasn't technology, wasn't perhaps some curricula, wasn't any of the discrete items that need to be improved. It was, in fact, the context, the connective tissue between all of them. And so the bottom line proposal of the Commission's report is that we believe that if we were to essentially harness all of that in an integrated and collaborative fashion, both of those adjectives are important, that we'd create a situation where an adversary from this day forward has to beat all of us to beat one of us. Given that, then I think that the market forces that are kind of offered in this section of how do you actually make it such that we improve the natural resilient robustness of the technology and the people, is that I think that there are 3 ways. One, you want to take advantage of the market forces that are inherently naturally there. People will often, not always, but often operate in their best interest if they're given the information necessary to do that. So you need to expose some data, some information that they would otherwise be unaware of, things that they wouldn't know, vulnerabilities, risks, or opportunities that they wouldn't know. I think the discussion that's taking place has perhaps shown some light on that. You need to then rationalize it so that it then makes sense, right? So that it's not so complicated. You need a PhD in physics or cyber to essentially make sense of it. And you need to make sure that when you do that, that there's some degree of authoritativeness that you can take it to the bank, like that you have some sense of the provenance of that. If you do those 3 things, then people who are naturally inclined to act in their best interest will. But you need to go further, which is you need to then reward them from doing so, perhaps by reducing their liability or improving their business opportunities. And then for that crowd, and there are going to be some who essentially still won't do the right thing, you need to compel them to do it. And so in this section, we have a Sarbanes-Oxley adjustment, which says, look, we've used market forces to the maximum extent possible, but at the end of the day, we will hold companies and other aggregators accountable for doing the right thing. And in some cases, that will be the kind of icing on the cake.
So if I might jump in, I mean, I agree with the, sure. I mean, I agree with the idea of holding liability for people. I mean, that's a great way to incorporate market forces into it. If people have to either buy insurance to offset it or end up being accountable, especially financially, but perhaps also legally for their inability to act.
Yeah, thank you. So the discussion of market forces starts to pull us into the second objective in terms of incentivizing better organizational cybersecurity, right? Recognizing that ultimately the entire cyber ecosystem is entirely man-made, right? We need to look at the mirror in terms of ourselves as the end users and organizations. What can we be doing to better incentivize organizational cybersecurity? Frank, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. And I touched on some of these issues, but I think some of the behavioral changes are actually very important here. So I think we don't balkanize these issues to a technology crowd, a governance crowd. The reality is it's all of the above. When I was at GW, we stood up the first MBA with a focus on cybersecurity. And I guess the tagline would be talk and squawk, meet, beep, and squeak. So you really do ultimately need people who understand both. They don't have to be at a PhD kind of level of capacity and or capability, but you really do need to have the senior most C-suite have an appreciation for cyber risk as they would for any other risk. And rather than try to put it in the zeros and ones, which the government used to do, and it used to turn it into a black magic kind of issues. I've got a secret, which sometimes are important. But we need to be able to treat cyber, because it is its own domain, but it transcends everything we do, air, land, sea, space. And the reality is it's happening faster and faster today than ever before. So I think that there are some incentives that we can look at, and I think many of those aren't reinventing the wheels. I think many have looked at what some of those opportunities are, but you need that galvanizing to be able to then ultimately, if you're a company and you're spending XYZ, if you're a big bank, you do it the old Willie Sutton principle. Why rob banks? That's where the money is. I mean, they're going to do it for their own bottom line. But the truth is we're dependent from an ecosystem across the entire supply chain, where we ultimately do have to find ways to incentivize others to take action more quickly. I like the labeling. I like the certification process. I'm not sure exactly how that plays out, but Lori, good on you for moving on that. That is where we need to get to. And if you think about it, I mean, our attack surface is just growing exponentially. And we are very good at looking at widget by widget. We're sometimes good at looking at systems. What we're really not good at is looking systems of systems. And that's precisely where we are in terms of grappling with some of these issues today. The entities that have the bottom line interest in play, they're doing it. But it's everyone else that consumers and other users are fully dependent upon. How do we incentivize them to take action? So from my standpoint, and it's not to be in a very meandering kind of diatribe here, but it's a governance issue. It's ultimately a C-suite issue, and it's ultimately incumbent upon the cyber world to put these issues in their terms, rather than us trying to force COOs, chief risk officers, and others to completely understand our world.
No, thank you, Frank. Opportunity to take it back to Lori. Other thoughts you'd like to share in terms of how we might be able to change cybersecurity behavior and encourage better practice?
Yeah, so I think, thinking through more where we can increase incentives, labeling can be an incentive, but only if there's some mandate behind the labeling. I think it's clear that organizations aren't going to adopt it of their own, free will. That we may get small numbers of it because it's a novelty, but if you want widespread adoption, I think we do need some teeth behind it. I think it's also important, you mentioned that this is a system. There's a lot of interconnected things. So we need to look not just at one label stuck on each product. We need this to be machine readable. We need it to be able to be processed at scale in the back end automatically, so that we can look at all the components in the system and be able to automatically look at what security properties, what standards they're complying with, how they work together. And so I think that's something we need. And that goes beyond the kinds of things that like an underwriter's lab does. I recently had a discussion with Underwriters Lab about their first products that they've certified with their cybersecurity label are I believe, GE kitchen appliances. And, they have one certification for all the GE kitchen appliances, which means that they have certified the refrigerator the same as the dishwasher. I find it hard to believe that there are not any different vulnerabilities in a refrigerator than a dishwasher. So I think we need something that may be a bit more fine grained than what is provided with that sort of a label.
Thank you. This section in Pillar 4 actually, has a bit to say on the current state of insurance products in mitigating and managing cyber risk, and some of the changes or actions that will be required to shape market forces. I guess I'll look forward first to you, Chris, or Martin. Anything you'd like to start off on that topic with us?
So I'll start. I'll just step into that question by perhaps extending the previous, which is that recognizing that the private sector is responsible for the mainstay of innovation, production, and the operation of this space, 85–90% by most accounts, if not more. The government has some unique roles. It can lead by example. It can use the power of the purse. It's not what it once was, but if it doesn't do that, it has no expectation that the private sector will do something similar. But the government then has unique and extraordinary authorities. It has convening power. That's in part what the Solarium Commission was trying to do, was having national conversation. And it can address, as you just indicated, some of those places where perhaps there's no market incentive to step into it. Natural disaster, very few entities without some extraordinarily high premium will insure that. So the government can step into insurance markets to say, we'll take the high end of that. Be that attributable to an act of war or an act of God, such that then there are opportunities for other market incentivized entities to step in and take care of the rest of it. The government might step into the space to say, we'll deal with nation state actors. Therefore, the rest of that problem can be addressed using the traditional market forces. The government can establish liability or incentives in ways that the private sector cannot do for itself. And the government can rationalize those things across various sectors when that's just hard to do in a market force only opportunity. So if the government takes that on, and I think using a word that Frank offered, which is to establish good governance in this space and the application of inherently governmental power in collaboration with the private sector, then I think we're going to be in a better place.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
So, yeah. So, you know, being that this is the political season, I'm going to answer your question with kind of a non-answer and talk about what I want to talk about, right? So, you know, so I was reflecting on your question and some of the conversation. It reminded me a bit of before my academic career, I worked in one of the, well, what was then the Big 8 accounting firms as a consultant, and it was just in the very early stages of automation in firms. The federal statutes, actually, I think it was through the SEC, ended up beginning to require what was then called EDP audits. They required, I mean, so executives could actually go to jail if their firms were out of compliance with EDP standards, if there was a substantial fiduciary breach of that. And so this was about the time when supply chains were being automated, when the entire firms were being automated. So and it turned out to, I think, fairly quickly add a level of reliability to the infrastructure that firms had. So I don't know whether we have the same kind of teeth in current cybersecurity legislation, but you know, again, since we're still fairly much in the early stages of this whole networking of our lives. I guess COVID has accelerated this a bit for all of us, right? I'm wondering to what extent those remedies would transfer. And I kind of like reading in the report this multi-layered approach where that would certainly be part of the picture.
Bill, can I jump on a couple of quick points?
Actually, the mention of supply chain, I was going to let you start to swing it over to objective 4, Frank, so take it.
Well, before I even get to that, and I'll try to be brief, you know, the insurance element is important here, and it's not as if companies and insurance companies haven't been thinking about this. I mean, the dilemma is actuarial data is still a little difficult to get your hands on, and at the end of the day, we want to get to the point where we can start battening down risk based on empirically based data and evidence. So this is as much a data science issue as it is a cybersecurity issue when you really get down to it. But at the end of the day, what you want to be able to do is, I don't know how many companies went into business thinking they were defending themselves against foreign militaries or Russian or Chinese intelligence services. This is an unlevel playing field. And quite honestly, that's where I think the government can step in. And we did propose a handful of recommendations around insurance. We took baby steps into that. But at the end of the day, there are historical analogies we can go to. So after 9/11, we had the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, or TRIA. TRIA should not have allowed companies to do nothing. It should allow them to raise all boats so you get your baselines higher, and Uncle Sam will only step in as the insurer of last resort. In other words, a catastrophic event or incident that's beyond a particular company set of issues. We really do need to calibrate, recalibrate, and titrate our issues similarly around cyber. That's where this public-private partnership becomes so important. I mean, we've all talked about this for decades, actually, but I think we're at the point where we know enough of what we actually do know and what we really don't know, that we can start putting some start putting some actions and verbs. There have been a number of very successful pilots around this. So I am optimistic, which is rare on a lot of these issues, but I am optimistic we can get our arms around this. On supply chain, and I'll be very brief, because I do recommend people tuning in, check out the report. We're not the first to recognize, obviously, that we've got a whole set of issues that we need to get our arms around here. But much like the cyber issue, we've treated this as a whack-a-mole problem. I call it, we've got a lot of tactics masquerading as strategy. When you look at the US government, there are actually a number of initiatives. There have been executive orders promulgated. There's the Clean Network Initiative that State Department is driving. There are a host of them. But at the end of the day, they're almost focused on TikTok here, Huawei ZTE there. There's nothing really pulling all these pieces together and providing an end state objective we need to move toward. One of the recommendations we made, and for transparency, I'm leading another effort for the government looking at economic security, and I think we will piggyback and double down on this recommendation, is the need for a supply chain intelligence center that is private sector driven, not just government driven. So in other words, when we talk about this public-private partnership, they don't just need a seat at the table. Quite honestly, they ought to be driving in some of these areas. And I think that this is an opportunity to get to the point that we all want to get to. So Chris, I'm sure will have much to add on. I didn't want to steal all the thunder, but I did want to pull the thread, because I think Martin's points are really important to be able to pull it from on the insurance side to make that a reality. So sorry.
No, Frank, thank you. Going to start to open it up to the panel. Other thoughts on the supply chain challenges or opportunities to make progress improvements there?
If I might just piggyback a little bit on Frank. I mean, I like the idea of the insurer of last resort. I mean, it just can't be cheap premiums though, because otherwise we end up with the people building houses in flood zones kind of a problem that we see today.
Yep.
All right, again, I'm sensitive to the clock and the fact that we could probably go an hour on each of these objectives and questions, but I do want to get to objective 5, which is around data security. So thoughts on what can be done to improve the security and privacy of Americans' data, and thoughts on the role of legislation where applicable. Laura, could I start with you?
Yeah, so I think that, security and privacy are kind of two different aspects, and we really need to focus on both of them. Right now, there's been a number of legislative proposals related to privacy, but it's not clear, where they're going. I do think that we should put some more effort at the national level of having some consistent privacy standards, because we're seeing a lot happening in the states, especially California, but other states are getting on board as well. And commerce is not just a state thing now; it's not local, and so we really do need to have some national efforts to give consumers some consistency in privacy and a foundation where there are certain privacy rights that will be respected without them having to go read all the fine print and figure things out.
Thank you. Martin, give you an opportunity if you'd like to weigh in on.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I agree with Lori that this is a really critical topic, and it's, I mean, they're in some ways two sides of a similar coin, but it's, and it kind of has to be jointly optimized. I mean, I guess I I guess thinking about personal privacy in particular, the things that worry me as much as data from IoT and data that are out there are kind of other kinds of data leakage because it's relatively cheap to collect, you know, like automated license plate readers that cruise around parking lots that can geolocate you when you don't necessarily want to be geolocated. So I think, I mean, the facial recognition technology, I mean, again, I don't want to have sound like a doomsday person here because I'm not really that way, but it's I think when we think about this, we have to think about it very, very broadly, not just about, you know, who's got access to our health records, even though that's also important.
Thank you. All right, I'll work towards the close with our commissioners. I'll go to Chris. If you would like, you can weigh in on the data security objective or take a closing remark wherever you would like.
Yep, so I'll help in efficiency's sake to do both. One, I was just going to comment on the Commission's commentary on privacy and breach, in that it discriminated between them. It says while they're related, they are different. It's as if you're looking through a telescope one way or the other. Privacy is something you deliver to individuals or to organizations, but a highly granular focus of how do I make sure that your information is protected and respected as such by those who traverse this space. Whereas breach information, what you want to do is to perhaps rationalize the reporting of that for the benefit of all. And to the point already made, rationalizing that might make it more efficient, more possible for us to share that information. The Commission addresses each of those in turn and tries to actually figure out how do we create market forces and to some degree regulation and compulsion to deliver that. My closing remarks would simply be that I think that a one-page read of the Commission's report and summarizing this discussion is that we have to mobilize all components, all disciplines, that's technology, people, roles, to create order, discipline, to meet our expectations in this space. We also, as a second component, have to mobilize all authorities. We have lived in the past in a world where we thought that champions would sally forth. They might have the word cyber or IT in their names, and that they would create order and discipline for us so that all we had to do was to step in and make our traditional mistakes. There are roles for individuals, for private companies, for governments, plural, and all of those must be not so much well-defined, but all of those must be expected and allowed to essentially move forward in an integrated, collaborative way, so that what we then get is a mutually reinforcing concurrent application of all of that. That's a mouthful, and it's sometimes hard to do as the space itself undulates and changes underneath of us. But I think, again, the bottom line recommendation of the Solarium Commission is we need to actually make it such that if you're an adversary in this space and you're crowdsourcing us with all of your adversary friends, from this day forward, we mean to do the reverse, which is you've got to beat all of us to beat one of us.
Excellent, thank you. I guess, Frank, give you an opportunity to weigh in before we head to audience questions.
Chris handled that exceedingly well. I'm not sure I can. The one item I would like to leave people with, though, is obviously, in addition to all the public-private partnership issues, we recognize that we need to look across borders on a lot of these issues as well, and we need to look most notably, whether it's supply chains and allies and others. They're going to be democracies, and those that are not so democratic in terms of autocratic nations are finding ways to exploit this quite dramatically. I grew up thinking the democratic way was the only way. That's a little bit a discussion item right now. So we need to take this very seriously. We need to engage with our allies, and we're not going to do this from our water's edge alone. This has to be driven public-private, public-public, private-private, and across borders. The one other point that I want to leave is we're getting a lot of great traction on a number of our national security recommendations, those that affect the Department of Defense, those that affect the Department of Homeland Security and CISA and FBI. These are some of the issues we need all of you to be as out there driving. They're just as important to our society, yet they're harder to sometimes get the momentum legislatively to be able to drive some of these issues. So I just ask that those watching and that are passionate about these issues, we need your help in terms of driving those and take it and rip them apart and come up with better ideas. But at the end of the day, these are some of the recommendations I'm a little concerned will not get as much traction as they need. And I hope that all of you can make that happen, because at the end of the day, national security and economic security are inextricably interwoven. And it just so happens that those that are the imperatives that people see immediately are getting a little, they're getting quick action and momentum on. I just ask that all of you help elevate some of these issues as well.
I would second that, and thank you. In the remaining minute or two here, I'm going to try to work in a few audience questions. The first one is for Lori. Based on your research, how does the notion of data stickiness come into play for how folks make their privacy decisions? And do consumers care about how easy it is to have control over their data, the permanence of their data when making purchasing decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the research that we've done with consumers has shown that consumers actually care a lot, that they want to be given choices. They don't always go and exercise them, but they want to know that they have choices. The problem is that it's very difficult to communicate all of this with consumers. And so consumers have very little idea about what privacy practices apply for a given product or service.
Thank you. Next question, serve it up to everybody. Given that the current advertising business model depend on personal data extraction, should policymakers separate security from privacy when pushing for improvements in software, business practices, and consumer culture?
As Chris, I would offer that I think to the point already made by others, the government and the sector itself should strive to deliver both of those, not to trade one for the other. We find that if you're essentially favoring one by risking the other, that's an equilibrium that cannot be sustained. And oftentimes what you have to do is to work harder as opposed to simply expediently trade one for the other. They should both be kind of put out there as desired goods.
And just one tactical point, secure coding actually matters in all this. If we were developing and designing airplanes the way we do code, we'd all think twice before we jumped on a plane. So I genuinely think that there is a technical underpinning here, and that's where I think all of us in universities and others have more to do. So, and I know that everyone on this video has been working in that environment, but we got to really double down on some of those efforts.
And could I just also add, which is that I've often heard it said that the consumer had long ago given up on his or her desire for privacy. As a veteran of the National Security Agency, I have to tell you that I don't think that's true. So because they care about who actually has penetrated their privacy. Amazon's one thing, Google's another, NSA is completely and distinctly a third. And so we need to take great care before we perhaps go too quickly into that assumption.
Okay. Well, I thank the panelists for their time and their inputs and insights. I'm going to fall back to Martin's analogy that we are early in the game. It's the early innings. So hopefully over the last 45, 90 minutes, you at least saw a compelling at bat. And we look forward to moving forward with the game in the future. I know we didn't get to do a lot of topics justice, but I hope that the conversation, in addition to being rewarding itself, compels you in whole or in part to take a look at the consortium's report, and also referencing, as it has been mentioned a few times, not just the report itself, but now up to the 4 additional white papers that have been published since its original publication. Would expect that series to continue. So keep an eye on the site and the commission's work, and we look forward to hearing from them. And we'll turn it back over to Beth. Thank you all.
Thanks, Bill. Actually, I'll step in. Thank you to our panelists too, Frank, Chris, Lori, and Martin. I'm Michael Lasanti, and I'm the Director of Partnerships for CILA, which is Carnegie Mellon Security and Privacy Institute and the university's collaboration hub for all things security and privacy related, our research and our education portfolio. And I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for the closing remarks. And the first up will be Commissioner Chris Inglis, who needs no introduction after participating in both of the panel sessions.
And following Chris, wrapping up today's event will be Michael Mcquaid, the Vice President of Research for Carnegie Mellon University. And Dr. Mcquaid is a triple alumnus of CMU and a member of the Defense Innovation Board. And prior to his role at CMU, Michael served in leadership positions at tech companies, most recently as a Senior Vice President for Science and Technology at United Technologies Corporations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris Inglis for closing remarks from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And Chris, when you're finished with your closing remarks, just please pass the baton over to Michael Mcquaid to wrap up today's events. So over to you, Chris.
Good, thanks. I think this is my second chance to give some closing remarks, and so I won't take unfair advantage of that. I'm just to build on what I'd said earlier, which is that the notion that the Cyberspace Solarium Commission brought forward, in addition to the pillars kind of 3 and 4 that we've talked about heavily today, was to how to make the government a more viable partner, not the imposer of consequences, not perhaps someone that accepted itself, from rational behavior and discipline in this space. And in that regard, Pillar 5 comes strongly to mind, and I'll just give a very quick summary of what Pillar 5 is all about, which is that the government would propose that it work with the private sector to determine what are the critical functions, calls them systemically important critical infrastructure, but leave the acronym aside. How do we define the critical functions? Not the critical entities, but those threads that cut across society. It might be a sustainable, viable economy. How does it then establish what the government would propose to provide as insights into that, whether that's the labeling information, the threat information, perhaps some intelligence derived from critical government sources? How would the government then collaborate in the defense of those critical functions? How would it actually stand on common floor plates and side by side, discover and mitigate those threats, not at the highest possible level, but at the lowest possible level with respect to classification or proprietary information, so that it created relationships, which really will be the significant outcome of that, as opposed to discrete injected consequences on the bad actors in that space. And then finally, how does the government use its tools, its authorities in a proactive way, so that we find ourselves in a position less and less simply reacting to the initiatives, the actions of adversaries, and more in creating order and discipline as the natural byproduct of the collaboration, so that we can realize the aspirations that all of us would have in cyberspace. I think that actually is the bottom line here, which is that we believe that we have the tools collaboratively in an integrated fashion to create the cyberspace we would prefer, but we have to actually combine those and integrate those as a matter of course. Gone are the days when we can afford to simply defend in our own silos and assume that we're defending a patch that we entirely own against threats that are arrayed only against one of us. So I appreciate that this conference has been sponsored and that we brought together a very diverse set of perspectives. I think that's actually in and of itself the lesson going forward about how we might make some further progress.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Mcquaid. I'm the Vice President of Research, as Michael Lasante said. And I get the unenviable task of welcoming you to Pittsburgh at the end of your conference. So let me just say thanks to the commissioners and thanks to everybody who took the time out for what I think were 2 really important sessions today. I hope in the process of that, you got a sense for where cybersecurity as a technology, but also cybersecurity as a social interaction issue and relevant sort of day-to-day operational issue sits in the scale of what goes on in Pittsburgh. I know Rob presented comments at the beginning. This partnership between Pitt and CMU is really exemplary of the way, not just cybersecurity, but in general, the way Pitt and CMU help define the city of Pittsburgh and the drivers in Pittsburgh. It turns out that if you stack up all of the different places where we have research collaborations at Carnegie Mellon, Pitt is #1 in count of the number of collaborative research programs that we have in place. It's not just because Pitt has a world-class medical school and we don't have a medical school, because it stretches into computer science and artificial intelligence and more into this broad field of cybersecurity, where we bring technical aspects together. We bring interaction that focuses in Scilab. We bring interactions that focus in the Software Engineering Institute. But we also bring important and critical issues around the legal aspects, the ethical aspects, the privacy aspects of cybersecurity. And I think recognizing that the two universities together really do create a fundamental capability in the overall field. It's a, and I hope you got some of this over the course of the days today. I always tell people that if you want to understand Carnegie Mellon, you have to understand the founding ethos behind the university. Andrew Carnegie started Carnegie Mellon, and there's a famous quote about a university whose purpose was to educate the children of the steel workers of his steel mill empire here in Pittsburgh. And there's a consequence of that which has fed the DNA for more than 100 years. And that's a DNA that says, while we will do basic fundamental research and we will do cutting edge science, and I would stand us up against anybody in the world in the areas we've been talking about today. The coin of the realm for the research agenda at CMU, whether it's technical or whether it's sociological or whether it's social sciences, the core coin of the realm is to be able to work on projects and problems that matter. And this ability to turn really core deep research, really core deep rationalization into something that matters. And I bring that up because I think the subject we're talking about today is absolutely critical. This is not just how do we bring more computer science tools to our arsenal? How do we define new ways to do DevSecOps so that our systems are deployed in a safer fashion? It is really very much intertwined with all the reasons that you have been talking about today. Things like privacy, things like the implication for international security, and the relationships we have that are both bilateral and multipolar. And I think when you put all those together, it's a very complicated field that we're in right now. I have lots of notes here, which I'm not going to cover, that talk about all the fabulous expertise that's here, but you heard from people like Lori during the course of the day. So we'll stipulate all of those. I simply want to come back to the work of the commission. And as Michael said, given some of the work we do on the Defense Innovation Board, I would just highlight a couple of things. One is we cannot either approach the field of cybersecurity nor approach what we should do about it with a narrow set of lenses. It has to be integrated into technology policy and human rights policy and international relations policy. And so this very broad ocean that we have to boil, this is not one of those cases where you can ignore the complexities of the field. The second thing is, and we have been very vocal about this on the Defense Innovation Board, is that the midterm and long-term success of this field and related fields, whether those are fields like autonomy or advanced manufacturing, is critically dependent on where the people are going to come from. And that is a volume question that will not be solved by our traditional education activities alone. We may be able to help lead the field at the high end, but the volume of personnel, skilled personnel in the private sector, in the government, and in academia is at a scale that's going to require us to look at new methods of bringing up to speed the workforce that we need across this field in so many ways. And then finally, I just highlight again, and it was mentioned in just the last panel, this ability to integrate cybersecurity into so many other workflow elements, whether those are the technology stack development elements. How does cybersecurity fit into an agile software methodology? How does cybersecurity fit into artificial intelligence, where AI will bring a whole new set of threat vectors and at the same time, a whole new set of skills and tools to bring to cybersecurity? But it's also a question of how cyber will fit into the development of policy. Cybersecurity will fit into the development of policy. How cybersecurity will fit into the development of legal structures, and how it will fit into the way we interact with our partners and adversaries around the world. So I think it's a very good event today. I think it's a very timely event. I think the work that the commission has been doing speaks to the complexity, but it also speaks to what this country can do when it puts its mind and its best volunteers to work an issue. And so if we've scratched the surface a little bit today, I think that's a good thing. I'll thank again everybody who helped organize and help put all this together. And with that, Michael, I'll turn it back to you to close this out.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael and Chris. And with that, I would just say thank you all for coming. Thanks again to the U.S. Cyberspace Commission and for the University of Pittsburgh for the collaboration. Thank you to everyone for participating. And so long, we'll see you next time.